Paul wrote his famous Epistle to the Romans near the end of his third missionary journey. He had been traveling through the regions of Macedonia and Achaia, collecting donations for the poor that he planned to give to the church at Jerusalem before traveling to Rome and then on to new missionary fields in Spain. Paul wanted to introduce himself to the Christians at Rome and present the essentials of his message. Because he addressed the concerns of both Jewish and Gentile believers, the Epistle to the Romans contains one of the most organized and complete explanations of the gospel. The basic theme is the righteousness of God. Paul defends God's right to condemn all men as sinners, to justify sinners by faith, and to decide the fate of nations by election. Romans is both theoretical and practical, sweeping in scope yet personal in tenor. However, Romans also contains some controversial statements. In the middle of an extended discussion about the fate of Israel, Paul said that Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. Over the centuries, theologians have debated what Paul meant and proposed different interpretations of this passage. This video will explain the meaning of Romans chapter 10, verse 4. Although there are no significant textual issues, the translations of this passage are very different. The following table shows the original Greek text along with several well-known translations for comparison. The Greek text reads, "Telos gar namu Christos eis dikaiasunen panti to pistuanti." The New King James Version renders this passage as, "For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes." The Good News Bible translates this passage as, "For Christ has brought the law to an end, so that everyone who believes is put right with God." But the New Living Translation puts it this way, "For Christ has already accomplished the purpose for which the law was given. As a result, all who believe in him are made right with God." And the New International Version translates the passage this way, "Christ is the culmination of the law, so that there may be righteousness for everyone who believes." The basic reason for this diversity is that several key terms in this passage have a wide range of meanings, which makes translating more difficult. For example, telos in this passage can refer to a termination, conclusion, goal, or toll. Second, Paul used the term nomos to refer to the Mosaic Law, the whole Old Testament, specific statutes or commands within the law, or as a reference to sinful human nature. Third, the preposition eis is very broad and can be translated as for, so that, or with respect to, each of which carries a subtle shade of meaning. Translators must choose suitable English terms based on the definitions of the original Greek words, the grammar of the sentence, and the overall context of the passage. For example, in Romans chapter 13, verse 7, Paul uses telos in the context of paying taxes, which indicates that he was referring to a toll or tribute money. Unfortunately, the context of Romans chapter 10, verse 4 isn't clear. Paul used the Greek conjunction gar to connect four subordinate clauses in verses 2 through 11 to the main thought in verse 1. These clauses explain his original thought, which forms the immediate context of this passage. Essentially, Paul is saying, "I hope and pray that Israel may be saved, because they are zealous but misguided, because they are ignorant of justification by faith, because Christ is the telos of the law, because law-based righteousness depends on obedience, while faith-based righteousness depends on the heart." In this context, telos could be rendered as end or goal and still makes sense. To make matters worse, theologians have long disagreed over Paul's view of the law. At times, Paul appears to criticize the law, while at other times he affirms the law as still binding for Christians. This tension within Paul's writings has led theologians to propose solutions that range all the way from antinomianism to theonomy. While many theologians favor a moderate position that upholds only the moral principles of the law, others believe that Paul's theology of the law is inconsistent and contradictory. As a result, theologians have proposed several different interpretations of Romans chapter 10, verse 4. In fact, there are no fewer than 8 different interpretations in the literature, but they are not all of equal weight among scholars. We will only consider the 4 most significant ones here. This situation illustrates the fact that every translation is an interpretation of the original. The translator always brings a personal bias to the interpretive process. New Testament scholar Vern Poythress observed that rigid interpretive frameworks can become self-perpetuating filters that lead to circular reasoning, dogmatism, and harshness. It is too easy, he said, to read into a passage what one afterwards reads out. The first interpretation of Romans chapter 10, verse 4 is that Christ is the end of the Mosaic law. This view has wide support, especially in Lutheran circles and among certain dispensational theologians. For example, Charles Ryrie believes that the law of Christ has replaced the Mosaic law. This new code contains some old commands, some new commands, and some revised commands. Henry Thiessen, on the other hand, feels that Christians are not required to obey any commands in order to please God, and that the Mosaic Code only serves as an instructive guide for understanding God's will. Everyone in this camp agrees that the Mosaic Law has passed away and that it is no longer binding for Christians. There is a complete break between the law and the gospel. However, there are several clear problems with this approach. First, Christ himself explicitly upheld the validity of the law for believers. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 17, Christ said, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven." Paul also expected Christians to obey the law and often cited the Old Testament as his basis. For example, in Romans chapter 13, verse 8, Paul wrote, "Owe no one anything except to love each other, for the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment are summed up in this word, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfilling of the law." And in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 1, Paul also wrote, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise." The New Testament often refers to the law as a present reality. Paul himself supported the practice of circumcision for Israelites and explicitly rejected the idea that faith nullifies the law. In Romans chapter 2, verse 25, Paul wrote, "For circumcision indeed is of value if you obey the law, but if you break the law, your circumcision becomes uncircumcision." In Romans 3, verse 1, Paul continued, "Then what advantage has the Jew? Or what is the value of circumcision? Much in every way. To begin with, The Jews were entrusted with the oracles of God. In Romans chapter 3, verse 31, Paul sums up the matter. Do we then overthrow the law by this faith? By no means. On the contrary, we uphold the law. The second interpretation of Romans chapter 10, verse 4 is that Christ is the end of the ceremonial law. Traditionally, Reformed theologians divide the Old Testament laws into moral, civil, and ceremonial categories. According to this view, the moral law is still binding for Christians, while the civil and ceremonial laws are not. So there is only partial continuity between the law and the gospel. However, there are several problems with this interpretation as well. First, Paul doesn't appear to be discussing only the ceremonial law in Romans chapter 10. Second, this view does not explain how ending the ceremonial law makes righteousness possible for believers. Theologian Thomas Schreiner asks, is salvation by law more easily attainable with the moral law still in force? Third, Scripture doesn't divide the law into three discrete categories, and any attempt to separate them is purely speculative and subjective. And fourth, in Acts chapter 21, Paul participated in the sacrificial rituals of the temple in order to demonstrate to Jewish Christians that he still observed the law. The third interpretation of Romans chapter 10, verse 4 is that Christ is the goal of the law. This has been an increasingly popular view, which was also prominent, if not dominant, throughout the history of the church. This view doesn't depend on determining how much of the law, or how little, is still binding on Christians. Several facts appear to support this interpretation. First, in Galatians chapter 3, verse 24, Paul described the law as a guardian or tutor to bring us to Christ, which portrays Jesus as the goal. In Romans chapter 9, verses 30 through 33, Paul also used some very goal-oriented language. Romans chapter 9, verse 30 says, "What shall we say then? That Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness have attained it, that is, a righteousness that is by faith. But that Israel who pursued a law that would lead to righteousness did not succeed in reaching that law. Why? Because they did not pursue it by faith, but as if it were based on works. They have stumbled over the stumbling stone, as it is written, 'Behold, I am laying in Zion a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense, and whoever believes in him will not be put to shame.'" In this passage, the Greek verb dioko implies earnestly pursuing a goal, and the verb katalambano refers to attaining a goal. Some people believe that Paul was building an athletic metaphor in which the Jews were racing to achieve their own righteousness by the works of the law, but stumbled over the rock of offense, namely Jesus Christ. However, there are several problems with this interpretation as well. First, the primary definition of telos is a termination or end, not goal or purpose, and Paul used the term telos as goal only once out of 11 times. So while this interpretation is linguistically possible, it is statistically improbable. Second, the racing imagery mentioned earlier in Romans chapter 9, verses 30 through 33, isn't found anywhere in Romans chapter 10. So that literary context can't automatically be applied to Romans 10, verse 4 without some compelling evidence. The fourth interpretation of Romans chapter 10, verse 4 is that Christ is the end of legalism. Thomas Schreiner believes that Paul is speaking experientially in this text, so that his point is that Christ is the end of using the law to establish one's own righteousness. New Testament scholar John Murray agrees, saying, Paul is speaking not of the Mosaic law in any specific sense, but of law as demanding obedience, and therefore in the most general sense of law-based righteousness as opposed to faith-based righteousness. His whole statement is simply to the effect that every believer is done with the law as a way of attaining righteousness. This interpretation, like the last one, doesn't depend on determining how much or how little of the law is still binding on Christians. There are several important facts that strongly favor this interpretation. First, it is consistent with the contrast between faith and legalism found in Romans chapter 10, verse 3. Second, the primary definition of telos is termination, not goal or purpose. Therefore, this interpretation is statistically more likely. Third, Paul used the term nomos, law, to refer to legalism in other passages. Theologian Walter Kaiser explained it this way. Often when Paul appears to be disparaging the law, he is instead debunking legalism. We agree with C.E.B. Cranfield that Paul had no separate word group to denote legalism, legalist or legalistic. Consequently, some of the passages translated as law are incorrect, for what he is opposing is the quest for a righteousness obtained as a result of one's own efforts and works. While the interpretation of telos as goal cannot be entirely ruled out, telos as the end of legalism clearly fits the facts better and is probably what Paul had in mind. It also has the advantage of sidestepping the whole law-gospel controversy associated with the first two interpretations. So in conclusion, we have seen that various translations of Romans chapter 10, verse 4 are remarkably different for several important reasons. First, several key terms have a wide variety of meanings. Second, the immediate context of Romans chapter 10, verse 4 isn't clear. As a result, theologians have proposed different interpretations based on their different views about Paul's teaching. One view is that Christ is the end of the Mosaic law, but there are many New Testament passages that explicitly contradict this interpretation. A similar idea is that Christ is the end of the ceremonial law, but Paul doesn't appear to be discussing just the ceremonial law, and this interpretation is undermined by Paul's own words and actions. Another view is that Christ is the goal of the law. While this interpretation is theologically and linguistically possible, it is unlikely because the primary definition of telos is termination, not goal or purpose. The most likely interpretation is that Christ is the end of legalism. This is the belief that a person can be righteous in God's sight through human effort alone. This interpretation is consistent with the context of Romans chapter 10, verses 1 through 3, and with the primary definition of the Greek term telos.